Imagine spending an entire season watching your franchise quarterback get systematically undermined by the people whose job it is to cover him fairly. Imagine watching beat writers arrive at conclusions before the evidence exists, watching television personalities blame a rookie for organizational failures that had nothing to do with the rookie's effort or preparation, watching a media environment construct a narrative around a young player so persistently and so selectively that the narrative itself becomes the story rather than what is actually happening on the football field. Imagine absorbing all of that through an entire difficult year, walking into a new season as the head coach responsible for that quarterback's development and deciding in the first week of voluntary minicamp that you have seen enough, that the reporters who demonstrated exactly how they intend to use their access can now exercise that access from the parking lot. Todd Monken just made that decision, and once you understand the full history that produced it, the only honest response is to acknowledge that the reporters sitting on the outside of that building put themselves there. Let me build the timeline for you properly, because the way this story is being framed in some corners of the conversation strips away the context that makes Monkin's decision not just understandable, but genuinely difficult to argue with. Voluntary minicamp. Early May. 3 days of throwing sessions in shorts and helmets, non-contact work, no live defense, no padded practices, no game film to analyze, no meaningful competitive evidence of any kind. 3 days. That is the sample size that Mary Kay Cabot, the lead beat writer covering this franchise, decided was sufficient to publish her assessment that Deshaun Watson represented the more likely starting option over Shedeur Sanders, the quarterback Cleveland selected 5th overall in the draft. Not after a week. Not after watching multiple practice sessions with varying conditions and personnel groupings. 3 days of voluntary work in early May, and she was already in print positioning the 5th overall pick as a secondary option behind a quarterback whose medical situation has been one of the most genuinely uncertain in the entire league over the past several years. I want you to feel the weight of that timing, because it reveals something specific and important about the nature of the coverage this quarterback has been receiving. She did not follow the evidence toward a conclusion. She arrived at minicamp carrying a conclusion, and then gathered whatever the 3 available days could provide to make it publishable. That is a meaningful distinction, and it is the distinction that explains every subsequent decision Monkin has made about the relationship between this organization and the reporters covering it. His response came in 2 stages, and I think both matter. He went on a podcast and addressed the competition directly, clearly, and without diplomatic evasion. No predetermined outcome. The evaluation would proceed based on real competitive evidence as the process developed. His decision would be informed by what he actually witnessed, rather than by narratives constructed from the earliest possible sample of the lightest possible work. That was the public statement. And then, almost immediately after delivering it, he pulled access. No media at training sessions, no reporters at the edges of practice sessions looking for material, no cameras capturing moments that would be stripped of context and dropped into the next installment of a narrative that had already been running for a full year before this season's minicamp had even started. He said what he believed clearly, and then he built a structure around those words that removed the problem from the preparation environment in the most direct way available to him. Now, I need to take you back through last season, because what happened in Cleveland across that entire year is the reason this moment exists, and you cannot properly understand Monkin's decision without understanding the environment Shedeur Sanders was dropped into after that draft selection. This is the part of the story that I think deserves the most careful attention, and it is also the part that the Cleveland media ecosystem, the same reporters now experiencing the locked door firsthand, almost entirely failed to cover with the seriousness it warranted while it was actively happening. Shedeur Sanders received 0 first-team repetitions in training camp. I want to be precise about that because the number matters enormously, not a limited workload, not a carefully managed introduction to professional football designed to protect a young player from being overwhelmed before he was ready. 0. The Cleveland Browns selected a quarterback in the top 5 of an entire NFL draft, and then made the organizational decision to deny him the foundational practice repetitions that every quarterback needs to begin building the chemistry, the timing, the familiarity with his coordinator's system that forms the developmental baseline everything else is built on top of. That decision had real, lasting, measurable consequences for Shedeur's ability to demonstrate what he was actually capable of when given competitive opportunities. It was one of the most significant organizational stories of the entire season. It deserved sustained and aggressive coverage. It deserved the kind of repeated, informed questioning that beat writers with sustained daily access to a franchise are uniquely positioned to apply when an organization makes choices that directly undermine the long-term asset they are supposed to be developing. The Cleveland media left it largely untouched. There was no sustained pressure campaign demanding answers, no consistent headlines forcing the organization to explain publicly and repeatedly why their 5th overall pick was being denied the foundational work every other starting caliber quarterback was receiving. That particular story did not generate the kind of engagement that keeps audiences consuming content, so it did not receive the sustained attention it deserved. The coverage machine redirected its energy toward a target that had proven more reliably productive, which was Shedeur Sanders himself. Rex Ryan materialized on national television and delivered what I can only describe as one of the more genuinely embarrassing performances I have witnessed from a football personality with his credentials and platform. He attacked Shedeur publicly, loudly, and on the record for not doing enough to get himself onto the first-team practice field. A veteran with decades of experience in professional football, someone who genuinely understands how organizations function and how practice rep distribution actually works at this level, sat in front of a national audience and blamed a rookie quarterback for being unable to force his way into repetitions that the organization had made a deliberate decision to withhold from him. Let that logic sit with you for a moment, because it does not survive contact with any serious thought. The Cleveland Browns failed to create the developmental environment their 5th overall pick required. Rex Ryan went on television and blamed the player for the predictable results of that organizational failure. And the follow-up question that should have been hanging in the air of every conversation that followed, the question about why the organization rather than the player was not being held accountable for what it had produced, never quite materialized with the force it deserved. Tony Grossi made the situation worse in a specific way that I want to address directly because I think it represents one of the genuinely indefensible moments in what became a sustained pattern. When Shedeur mentioned arm soreness, Grossi used it as an attack vector. He questioned the player's toughness on air. He questioned Shedeur's commitment to the game. He essentially suggested, openly and in public, that a quarterback who had been given almost nothing to do had no legitimate basis for experiencing any physical discomfort from that almost nothing. I am going to state the obvious thing that apparently was not obvious enough to prevent this take from making air. The organization controlled his repetitions. His body responded to its actual workload the way every athlete's body responds to its workload, which is to say, normally and predictably. A reporter then took that completely ordinary physiological reality and constructed a character indictment out of it, broadcasting that indictment to an audience that trusted him to apply real expertise to his analysis. That is not informed football commentary. That is someone with a platform using it to damage a young player's reputation through reasoning that falls apart the moment you spend 30 seconds examining it carefully. And then there is the larger pattern that Cabot assembled across the entire season, brick by brick, piece by piece, with the consistency and the platform reach that the lead beat writer position provides. She called Shedeur undisciplined. She called him narcissistic. She produced week after week of content building the case that Dillon Gabriel represented the better competitive option, that the Browns may have miscalculated in their draft evaluation, that the opportunities being withheld from Sanders should probably be flowing toward Gabriel instead. She did this from the position of highest credibility in the local coverage ecosystem, which means her narrative carried a weight and a reach that amplified its impact well beyond what a peripheral voice could have produced. She built a sustained case against a first-year quarterback who had never been given a fair foundation to show what he was actually capable of. And when a new season arrived and the opportunity presented itself to approach the competition with the kind of genuine openness that the position theoretically demands, she returned to the same conclusion she had maintained all year. 3 days. Watson, the more likely starter. Same destination, same pathway, different calendar. That is not reporting in any sense that the word is supposed to carry. Reporting means you follow evidence toward whatever conclusion it actually supports, even when that conclusion is inconvenient for a narrative you have previously invested in. What Cabot has been doing is arriving at a conclusion through some process that precedes the evidence, and then selectively assembling whatever is available to lend it the appearance of evidentiary support. Those are fundamentally different activities, and one of them is journalism, while the other is advocacy operating under journalism's cover. Monkin watched this play out from inside the building where the actual football was happening, from the position of someone who had access to all of the information that the reporters constructing those narratives did not have, and he arrived at a conclusion about what this particular group of reporters had demonstrated regarding their intentions with their access. The demonstration had been clear and extended and consistent. He removed the access. I want to be specific about something that I think gets lost in the immediate reaction to decisions like this one. Media access to a professional football team's preparation is not a guaranteed right. It is a professional privilege extended in exchange for the implicit understanding that the access will be used to inform rather than to manufacture. When the use of that access demonstrates, over the course of an extended period, that the manufacturing has replaced the informing, the organization extending the privilege is not obligated to continue extending it indefinitely. The reporters can still write whatever they choose to write. Nobody has removed their platforms or restricted what they are permitted to publish. They are simply no longer inside the building while the preparation happens, which means they can no longer use proximity to the preparation as a tool for constructing the next installment of a narrative that has already been running regardless of what the preparation reveals. What I want people to fully grasp about this decision, beyond the immediate access conversation, is what it represents from a developmental standpoint for the quarterback himself. Media environments are not neutral external noise that players can simply choose to tune out through sufficient competitive focus. The narratives that circulate around a young quarterback seep into his environment in ways that are real, even when they are not physically present inside the facility. They reach the people in his building. They shape the external perception that determines how his early career gets remembered and how his performances get contextualized in the coverage that follows. They demand active mental energy to manage and filter, which is energy that could and should be going directly into preparation. Every manufactured controversy is a distraction with a real cost. Every negative cycle that builds momentum in the coverage ecosystem creates static that bleeds into the spaces where focus is supposed to live. Monkin watched Shedeur Sanders spend an entire season managing that static on top of a developmental situation that was already deeply inadequate, and he made the decision that the people responsible for generating that static had exhausted their reasonable claim to continued proximity to this quarterback's preparation process. There is also something being communicated here about the relationship between Monkin and Sanders that goes beyond the access decision itself and speaks to what kind of coach Monkin genuinely is. He went on a podcast and stated publicly, with clarity and without hedging, that this competition carries no predetermined outcome and that every evaluation will be honest and merit-based as real evidence develops. That is a public commitment of a specific kind. Closing the building is the structural reinforcement of that commitment. It is the difference between saying you believe in your quarterback and actually constructing the conditions in which that belief can be realized without interference from outside actors whose track record regarding this quarterback is already thoroughly established. Monkin has seen enough of what Shedeur Sanders is through everything that was asked of him last season, through the resilience required to operate inside that environment without the foundation he was owed, through the consistency of his preparation under circumstances that would have broken the focus of less grounded players, to know what he has. His responsibility now is to build a wall around the developmental process and allow it to proceed without the people who spent last season undermining it having daily access to the next chapter. What Monkin did is not complicated, and it is not subtle, and I think the attempt to frame it as some kind of dramatic overreach misreads it completely. He identified a specific, documented, extended problem. He made a concrete structural decision that removes the problem from the environment rather than issuing a statement expressing his displeasure while leaving everything functionally unchanged. An actual wall instead of a symbolic objection. That is what real organizational protection looks like, and it is what real organizational support for a young quarterback's development looks like when the head coach is genuinely committed to creating the right conditions for that development, rather than simply saying the right things about it in front of cameras. The reporters on the outside of that building understand exactly why they are there. They made a series of choices across an extended period about how to use the access they were given, and those choices are documented and available for anyone who wants to examine them honestly. Monkin examined them. He made his decision. And Shedeur Sanders is now preparing for a season inside a facility where the people whose coverage of him last year demonstrated what their access was being used for are no longer present to use it the same way again. Whatever you think about access policies and organizational transparency in a general sense, the specific history that produced this specific decision is not ambiguous. The reporters locked out of that facility were not locked out arbitrarily. They were locked out consequentially. And the sequence of events that led to the consequence is entirely available for examination by anyone willing to look at it honestly.